Jim, really appreciate you carving out some time today.
Thanks so much, Marc. It's great to be with you.
Listen, I'd love to start this conversation by kind of going back to the beginning and picking your brain on what really ignited that passion or that desire to pursue the career in sports psychology.
Yeah, so I grew up in a family that was very active. And so we would, mountain climb and non-technical rock climb and played a bunch of variety of different sports. And my father even did master's track late in life. And so that was fun going to those meets and seeing some of the older guys that still had something to give. And that was a lot of fun. But what I realized early on was that the biggest battle that I had to face was an internal battle. And, if I can't beat myself or overcome myself, how am I going to beat, this other opponent or this other team? And, it's those small battles that really fascinated me, in terms of just, either getting too anxious or getting too distracted or getting too discouraged if things weren't going well. And I never found really any good satisfactory answers to my questions. So, hey, I get nervous before I compete. What can I do? And, coaches and, my parents and others would say, oh, don't worry about that. And this was back in the day to be fair to everyone. So when I started learning about sports psychology, I was always interested in psychology and what makes us tick. And when I started learning more about sports psychology, it's like, whoa, there's a discipline. Mm-hmm. And we're not just born with confidence or without confidence, but we could learn these characteristics of champions. That really got me excited. And I've been enjoying the ride ever since.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's amazing to see how far things have come. I imagine you must be astounded as well in the last 20, 30, 40 years, how far things have come on the performance side and how the mental game is really where everyone's main focus is now. I mean, sleep's been sort of mined for a lot of its benefits, and nutrition, great to see over the last decade as well. And in your first book, The Champion's Mindset, I like how you open up the book with a terrific quote from Peyton Manning about attitude and how, it sounds quite simple. The attitude that you bring to a situation is going to really determine success or failure. And while it seems simple, it's not really easy, is it? Can you talk a bit about how attitude is playing such a big role and maybe some of the roadblocks that prevent everyone from just bringing the right attitude?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's important to mention is that we all have a negativity bias. So for purposes of survival, we're always kind of looking for what could go wrong or what isn't going well. And most of us have anywhere from 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day. I've heard different estimates, but the point is we have a lot of thoughts. And what we do know about those thoughts is that most of them are negative. Mm-hmm. And again, the brain is operating under a safety first principle. And so that might keep us alive, but it's not going to necessarily make us successful. So it actually does take a lot of work and effort to think like a champion, to have a great attitude, even when things aren't going well. And I do love the idea that anyone could have a great attitude when things are going well. What champions try to have is a great attitude when things aren't yet going well. And so that does take some, effort and work. And why that's important is because the mind, controls the body. And I like to say that, your muscles are always listening to what your mind says. So even though most of those thoughts are going to be negative, we do have the option of whether to ignore those thoughts, kind of in a mindfulness approach.
Yeah.
Or in more of a sports psychology, cognitive behavioral approach, is challenge those thoughts and replace them with more productive thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, we're defaulting to these negative thoughts. And so, how do we start to develop some strategies to get away from the, don't hit this in the water, don't miss this free throw. Obviously, when we think about the future, it's easier to promote that sort of anxiety. So are there initial places to start to combat those types of strategies?
I think a really good place to start is to think about, when I'm performing my best, when I'm really rolling, when, maybe in the zone or maybe some sort of micro zone, what am I thinking and how am I feeling? And then compare and contrast that to, okay, when I'm really struggling or I've hit a wall in my performance, what am I thinking and how am I feeling? And then notice the difference between those thoughts and feelings. And then, okay, let's rehearse, let's work on the thoughts that work for me. And then, especially when those negative thoughts pop up, having a game plan in terms of how to tackle those thoughts. So for example, one of the top softball players in the country that I'm working with, she was really struggling with, really tough conditioning in her, with her college program. And, she wasn't used to it at the high school level. So it was a big adjustment moving up to the college level.
For sure.
So she was having thoughts like, maybe I don't belong, maybe I'm not good enough. Can I really do this? And, her confidence took a big hit in her conditioning. And so what we talked about is, okay, let's replace those with more powerful and productive thoughts. So she came up with, I'm not alone. I can do this. I am strong. So I'm not alone. I'm with my teammates. We're all in it together. And then I can do this. I am strong. And she kept repeating those thoughts. And then she got back to me with a text message saying, I crushed the workout today. And, and then she was off and running after that.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing how much obviously athletes are working on their physical games and the mental game being such a key differentiator between winning and losing, and how we need to be working more on our mental game. And, whether the strategies are, is it the self-talk, the goal setting, the visualization, the breathing techniques? I mean, there are a plethora of different techniques. Is it really context driven in terms of what that individual needs? Are there certain starting points for people with their, coach or athlete listening in?
I like starting with a psychological framework or a particular mindset, which is think gold and never settle for silver. And so you got to start with, do I really want to see how good I can be? Mm-hmm. And how badly do I really want that? And once you decide to go after big things in life and, you have big ideas and big goals, then it's like, okay, I need to start looking at everything that comes, my way as a challenge to meet rather than a threat to avoid. So when you're really thinking gold in your life and wanting to live a gold medal life, you have to attack everything instead of, run for cover. And so I like to start with that. And it's kind of having a predator mindset or, a champion mindset or attitude. And then all the skills and strategies help to support that in terms of building our confidence, our concentration, our composure, and commitment.
Gotcha. I know there's certain aspects with certain groups of athletes that tend to be the areas that we need to focus on, or does it become very individual to the person of those particular traits that you're trying to support?
Well, what I've found, which is really cool, is athletes are so different in terms of body type or maybe even age, but high performance is high performance in terms of thinking like a champion. So there's a lot more similarities, if I'm working with a champion in one sport and a champion in a different sport, it could be a football player and a gymnast, then, maybe it might look on the surface. So to me, a lot of it does go back to self-talk. Are you being your own best friend or are you your own worst enemy, during the day in terms of your preparation? And then of course on game day when it's time to compete.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, my generation was sort of the Bobby Knight, a lot of, the coaches getting on the players and they would lift you up as well. But I think a lot of those patterns can get ingrained and people with just kind of using that same sort of self-talk. But perhaps in your own life or a coach's life or an athlete, there's no coach there to actually lift you up like they might have done in the past. So can you talk about some of those loops that we might get stuck in and how that can really start to derail someone's mental game?
Yeah, it's really easy. Again, it's just kind of garbage in, garbage out. We tend to get stuck with, negative, repetitive thoughts. So we might, have a tough game and we underperform and we just really start to beat ourselves up. I suck, I'm terrible, I let the team down. And even though that feels a little bit good in the sense that it shows that I care and, and I'm not happy with settling for less than my best, it really just eats away at our core confidence. And so you really need to nip that in the bud and say, what did I do well? Give myself credit for that. What can I do better? And now that I know that, and sometimes it's just a small adjustment or, a little correction, I'm going to really start putting my best foot forward by making that correction. So now I'm a better player. And so it's looking at kind of like when I do well, give myself credit. That's like me to do that, reinforce your self-image. When you don't do well, that's not like me to do that. What did I learn? What's going to help me next time? And so then a loss becomes something more than just a stumbling block. It becomes actually a stepping stone. And what's really cool about that is then you could be more driven. So I've had athletes that say, at the top level say, when I win, I'm happy. And when I lose, I'm more driven. So it's kind of, you can't lose either way, if you have that mindset.
Oh, it's tremendous. And, Doc, when we think about some of the athletes, I'm thinking a lot of basketball players now, especially because they come into the league at such a young age. And of course, at Canada basketball, we get them 13 years old and we see this progression, which is great to actually be there for that whole progression. But a lot of them are obviously succeeding at a high clip the whole time. I mean, there's no real there's challenges, but there are no real fundamental challenges, maybe until they reach this really high level where now they're not the star player. They're not getting all the minutes. They're at the end of the bench. And this might actually be, despite best intentions along the way of being able to put in some of these skills, mental skills, it might actually be the first time where they really realize I've got to do something, or maybe they don't, but it's a situation in which it's going to really be useful for them now. How do you navigate that when you're, particularly if the athlete maybe isn't the one to realize that they need that mental training. They might be a little bit on the fence, or unfortunately some of those athletes that are a bit standoffish, but we know that this is the thing that's really separating them from being able to realize, like you say there, realizing their potential.
Yeah, it's really tricky because for athletes that are not quite the best at what they do, they realize, look, I need to be mentally tougher, or, I can't get away with making too many mistakes, mental mistakes out there on the field or on the court. So they could be a little bit more open-minded about, what do you got for me today? If they see me. Whereas some of the superstars are like, hey, I didn't need this to get to this point, so I don't need it now. And, my attitude is what got you here isn't necessarily what's going to keep you here. It's not a race just to get to this level. It's a race to stay at this level and see how good you can be.
100%.
I do think that sports psychology is definitely becoming sexier and, kind of more in vogue. And I think that's important, especially mental health as well. And I have a doctorate in sports psychology, but I'm also a licensed mental health counselor. And so sometimes athletes might come to see me for personal issues and then say, well, what do you got for me, in terms of my game, or vice versa. We're working on their mental game. And then it's like, man, my parents are going through a divorce, or, I'm dealing with some substance abuse challenges. And so I really like working with the total athlete. What's really helped me is word of mouth. So a lot of the pro athletes I work with have said, hey, I have a teammate that could really benefit from talking with you. And that really opens the doors for that other athlete to say, well, hey, if you're working with my teammate, then, this might not be so bad.
100%. I mean, it is amazing, isn't it? How if the leader or somebody in that position on a team or organization takes that step, then all of a sudden it's a lot easier for everybody else. And I'm fascinated by this question around sort of mental performance and mental health, especially with the rise of awareness around mental health. Where do you see that line around, we want to support an athlete's physical health to let them recover and perform their best. And that's something we're doing more of with sleep and nutrition, et cetera. And as we move towards mental performance, that mental health aspect and all the different demands on athletes, whether it's, emotional life, family life, all the social media, where's that sort of line for you? Or is there a definition around mental health to mental performance? Could you share some insights there?
It's actually a pretty blurry line, because at the end of the day, we're a whole person. But traditionally, at least I looked at it as, are you able to separate what's going on off the court with what you're doing on the court? So kind of have a mental locker when you show up to the court or show up to practice. It's like, hey, I'm going to put all my personal stuff in my mental locker and be here, 100% focused on what I need to do. Or the other way around, if I have a tough game, going through a rough patch in my performance, am I able to kind of leave that behind in my actual physical locker, so to speak? And then when it's time to, focus on school or family or other responsibilities, I'm able to do that 100%. So that's ideal, but I think that's kind of hard to do, because, wherever we are, there we are, in terms of with all the stuff going on in our lives. And, it's nice in theory to be able to compartmentalize, but so I really think that it's important to have a go-to person. When I was working for the San Francisco Giants baseball organization, there was a phrase in the organization, but also throughout Major League Baseball, which was never suffer alone.
Yeah.
And I think just sometimes having that person that, hey, man, this is what's going on the field. This is what's going on off the field. I just have someone I could talk about those things with, get a little bit of clarity, learn some skills and strategies. That could be a huge difference maker.
Yeah, 100%. And, when you look at organizations, would you think that there's a brainstorming here of a role? You imagine if people are really dealing with significant mental health issues, obviously reaching out to the team psychologist is one thing, but there are potential conflicts there, I guess, from the player or even the coach thinking, how will this affect my playing time or my status? Is this where we need sort of third parties to come in to really be able to support teams and coaches and athletes?
Yeah, I think there's pluses and minuses in terms of having someone on board because then they're around you. You know, usually if you're a pro athlete or a college student athlete, you're pretty busy. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you don't have huge blocks of time. So having someone right there available when you need to speak to them is important. And, you know, just to be transparent, though, on the other hand, it is tough to kind of go see someone within the organization when people could see you walking into that person's office. And it's like, well, what are they going in there for? Or,
Hmm.
you know, what's that all about? And, you know, can I really trust this professional that they're not going to share it with the coaches? And so it is kind of a dance, you know, in terms of
Yeah.
trying to figure all that out. I've actually had athletes that have reached out to me from other organizations, obviously, and said, you know, yeah, we got someone, but I'd rather meet with you. And then it was interesting when I did leave the San Francisco Giants baseball organization, some of the players that I never really worked with, I was friendly with, said, hey, I'd love to meet with you. I'm like thinking, why didn't you meet with me when I was there? So I think they were
Yeah.
just more private
Yeah.
in terms of what they wanted.
I mean, it's great to see athletes actually making that first step these days, isn't it? Whereas it feels like a generation ago, that would have been much less likely, no?
Yeah, well, there's the old joke on the PGA Tour is that, you know, 25 years ago, if you met with a sports psychologist, you're pretty weird. But nowadays, if you're not working with a sports psychologist, you're pretty weird. And
Yeah,
so,
exactly right.
but you're absolutely right. A lot of athletes are reaching out to me now saying, "Hey, things are going pretty well. I just want to see how good I can get at my sport." And so it's, you know, nothing necessarily, they're not in a slump or nothing's necessarily going wrong. It's just I want to leave no stone unturned and see how great I can be. And I know the mental game's important. Whereas early on in my career it was that, yeah, I'm going through a slump or I'm injured or I'm depressed, those kind of things.
Yeah, it must be quite satisfying because it's easier, isn't it, to build that foundation, everything that you really want to implement when someone's in that place rather than just waiting until whether it's their diet or their exercise or their mindset's in a slump. And then we've got to try to use some of those acute strategies just to get out of the hole, right?
Yeah, and that's actually something that I hear a lot from athletes that finally do come in to see me. I had an NFL player recently reach out, and you know, I said, "How long were you thinking about contacting me?" And he said, "Several months." And you know,
Yeah.
that's not uncommon. You know, before we finally pull the trigger, but he did. He did pull the trigger, and I thought that was great. And after the first session, he's like, "Man, feel like, you know, just a weight's been lifted off my shoulders. Just having someone that, you know, that's kind of neutral, that kind of, you know, has worked with other
Hmm.
pro athlete that understands me, just being able to talk to you about all these kind of things, all the challenges and expectations and pressures." And so I really do like the proactive approach. And that's why the younger, the better for me in terms of working with student athletes. It's because a lot of times what I would see is it would be a college student athlete at the end of the first year. And it's like, man, I've really hit a wall this year. And after the first couple sessions, they're like, man, I wish I started this in high school so that when I got to college, I hit the ground running instead of, man, you know, like I really took a hit with my confidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see that shift's happening, and it's interesting. You talk about high expectations. Your new book, the leader's mind: how great leaders prepare, perform, and prevail. Um, you talk about high expectations that we face, not just in the performance realm, but like we talked about before, whether it's the workplace, at home. And so, how do we start to change the way that we're processing all these things that are happening to us to be able to lead at the workplace in our performance, but also at home, because there's sort of different arenas, if you will, right?
Yeah, you know, leadership has never been more important. And especially the younger generation, they want you to get to know them. They expect you to be emotionally intelligent versus maybe, you know, at least when I was younger, it was more prescriptive. Leadership was more prescriptive. Here's what I want you to do because it's going to work for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Versus now it's more inclusive in terms of, you know, engaging with with the athletes or, you know, with your family members or others and saying, you know, hey, what are you thinking or how are you feeling, and
Hmm.
making it more of a team approach. And so that's definitely the way things are going in the workplace and in the sports world. I've definitely seen that shift myself in terms of working with coaches. And this is so important because, you know, especially in the work world, what's the saying that people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses. So, you know,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
definitely
for
want.
sure.
And then, you know, research also shows that the average American worker, probably for any worker, their engagement level is only about 50% at work. They're kind of disengaged. Maybe they
Hmm.
don't feel included. They don't feel there's any ownership on their part. And so having a really good leader that sets the right tone is really everything.
Absolutely. I mean, you opened the book with talking about where to start with leadership, and it's, again, I think might surprise people, this idea of being a good person first. It's so how do our values and being a good person actually enable us to really be good leaders?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we really need to do is, ask ourselves if we're in a leadership position, and it doesn't have to even be a formal leadership position, but would I want to work for me today? Or would I want to, if I'm coaching athletes, would I want to play for me today? And so I think part of being a good person is having everyone's best interest in mind and at heart. And so a lot of that falls under, I guess you would say, servant leadership in terms of, we're all in this together trying to do something special. And I care about you, not just in terms of your production, but who you are as a person. And I'm going to be looking out for you, I have your back. And there's going to be times where I challenge you. There's going to be times I support you. And that's just kind of like also being like a good parent as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite stories from Steve Kerr, who's also featured in the book, is when he took over the job with the Golden State Warriors, he called up all the players and actually went out to go see all of them. And, it's easier to do with a smaller team like in basketball versus, let's say, in football or other sports.
53 guys.
Exactly. But he ended up going and visiting and, hey, where do you like to go to dinner? What do you like to do away from basketball? Tell me about your family and friends. And I think that really set the right tone that, I'm here to help you reach your goals. I'm not just here to get something from you.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at, teams like the Spurs, let's say, a few years back when they had Ginobili and Parker and going out to dinners together was sort of often hear that talked about. And of course, over dinner, you talk about family and friends and aspirations and whatnot. Well, we hear the word culture thrown around so much. And of course, every organization has their own culture and wants to build a culture, but there are sort of very few that really have that ingrained culture. Is it as simple as going out to dinner together, or how can we really start to form some of these bonds that the athletes or the people that are working for us really know that we do have their best interest?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of what you're talking about comes from Paul Ratcliffe, and he's the head coach for Stanford Cardinal women's soccer, the winningest coach, men or women teams in Stanford history. And he's won 3 national championships, a ton of awards, individual awards and also team awards. And he just has a great attitude about culture. He says it's not Paul Radcliffe's culture, it's Stanford, it's the Stanford Cardinal women's soccer culture. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways that he makes sure that it's that way is he'll ask the players, hey, let's write down on a card or talk with each other. What's important to you? Is being competitive important? Is training to the max important to you? What's important to you? And we're going to make sure those are our values together. And, how can we encourage each other to stick to those values and principles and then, maybe even enforce them as well. So I really like that he takes kind of like almost a bottom up approach instead of like, okay, here are my values. You guys got to follow along with what I want versus, hey, what's important to you? And how can we make sure that we live those values?
That's tremendous. And, when we think about different environments in the book, you talk about a lot of different environments, competitive environments like medicine and surgery. And of course, traditionally, a lot of male egos, a lot of swearing and potentially throwing of things, which you mentioned in the book. Mm-hmm. But you give it through the eye, you talk about it through the eyes of a female surgeon. And so this notion of really trying to find your true self and of course, your own leadership style, how much do we blend into a certain environment versus starting to layer in our own self into that. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, it could definitely be tricky because on the one hand, you want to be really authentic and true to yourself. On the other hand, as part of a culture, there's a little bit of give and take. And mm-hmm. So one of the chapters features Katrina Furlick, and she's a neurosurgeon and also co-founder of Health Prize Technologies. So she had this kind of career change where she had a startup and, wanted to make sure in terms of medicine adherence and so forth. And mm-hmm. She talked about that a lot of the early surgeons that she came across that were women almost felt like they had to act more manly mm-hmm. to fit in. And she said that was kind of off-putting because it's like, it didn't feel authentic to them, but it was understandable that they felt that they had to act that way. So she said, kind of like, not necessarily be too thin-skinned when you're working with males that are like, oh, you must be the nurse, and yeah. Even though that obviously doesn't feel good and it's not a nice thing to be considered that, but hey, I could show you that I have a sense of humor. I could show you that I could fit in. And then a lot of those people that maybe would look at her differently because she was a woman would eventually come around. And some of those were from other cultures or other countries. So yeah. She said, make sure that you have a sense of humor and that, if you do a good job, people are going to come around. But she wanted to be, she didn't want to feel like I need to be that pound the desk type of leader in the operating room, I want to be more cooperative. And so she was able to really find that sweet spot for herself.
Yeah, and she talks about a lot of the different styles, obviously being a surgeon and working under, learning from the leads and of course the different styles that there would be of people who sort of commanded as we would traditionally, whilst others were more inclusive and allowing the younger surgeons to be able to do more within that. We talk about how today there's a bit more inclusivity. I imagine we still need to sort of be true to ourselves and how we would typically lead, or how much are we, obviously with our group that are in front of us today. I'm just thinking now of, our young kids at Canada Basketball, or some of the younger athletes I have, and how we talked about how they want to be more inclusive. And I guess where's that line between here are some of the things that we need, here are some of the fundamentals that we've got to cover. But to your point, what's important to you and how can we support that?
Yeah, it reminds me of self-disclosure in terms of the counseling work I would do, which is, it's fine to share stuff about yourself as long as you're doing it for the benefit of, of your client. You're not just like trying to unload your own stress on the client. But so, I think it's important to be authentic, but, as a professional as well. But I think communication is key. I've been a part of a lot of organizations where communication wasn't too good. And so to me, that's the starting point. And all the leaders featured in the Leader's Mind book are great communicators. And it doesn't mean that they have to give all these rah-rah speeches. It's just that they communicate how they're feeling or what they're thinking, or they show an interest in, again, what others are thinking and feeling. One little tip that I like to give to coaches is to ask your players, what do I need to know about you as your coach so I can be the best coach for you? And maybe write that on an index card. And it's amazing how many times coaches said, that sounds so obvious. I can't believe I never thought of that. And they would get back stuff that would surprise them. Some of it, I expected that from that player, but sometimes it'd be like, wow, that player really wants me to coach him hard. Or, hey, that player really prefers, more positive reinforcement. I thought they were the opposite. So I think that's really important. I also ask athletes to go up to your coaches and say, what do you expect from me, or what can I expect from you? And so have those conversations. A lot of misunderstandings happen when communication isn't there. So I remember one soccer player I worked with, she wasn't playing much. And I said, well, how well do you know coach? And she said, well, he doesn't like me. And I'm like, well, how do you know that? And anyway, I encouraged her to get to know him better. They went on a big road trip and she sat next to him on the airplane. And just, hey, coach, tell me about yourself. And here's a little bit about myself. And they just kind of became, fast friends, over the trip. And then all of a sudden she started playing more. But she's like, man, he's such a cool guy. I didn't realize how much we had in common. And he assumed that, I wasn't happy on the team, or I assumed that he didn't want me on the team. But once they got through that, all of a sudden, it was a true win-win.
Yeah, it is amazing how communication can be a major stumbling block, even at the highest levels. And when you talk about things like body language, I'm thinking of different athletes. I'm actually first thinking of golfer. I mean, Rory McIlroy sort of seems like the most obvious example of when he's playing well, he's just strutting down the fairway. And, years ago when he's winning by 8 or 10 shots, and it just, even the competition could see that. And it was almost like, we got no chance here. He's going to win by a mile. When he wasn't playing well, he the shoulders would slump and he'd be sort of dragging the putter behind him and these types of things. And, he's even mentioned this even recently with his obviously still incredible successes, but to his level, wanting more majors is obviously, a high bar. Can you talk to the body language story? Because it is amazing how our body is impacting our mind and vice versa.
Yeah, it's such a good point that you're making, because, you could almost look at the four wheels of a sports car, in the sense that you have kind of mind, emotion, physiology, and then more kind of like, body language or posture. And they all influence each other. So, as an example, if you put a big frown on your face and look down at your feet, it's hard to feel happy. And, versus if you looked up with a big smile on your face and kind of had your hands up in the air, it's hard to feel sad. So all these systems are kind of working with each other. And so sometimes we need to act our way into a certain way of feeling versus, maybe feel ourselves into a certain way of acting. So I like the idea of act as if. So when you're not playing well, act as if you're about to turn things around, or act as if your spirit can't be broken. And, I like the saying that body language is a billboard for your mental toughness. And so when your body language is down, you're telling the other team, beat me now.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, I can't do this. And then you're also giving the message to your teammates that you can't count on me. So to me, body language is one of those things where, man, you really got to act like a champion. And so I'll encourage athletes, especially practice this in your preparation, but, walk with a little bit of a swagger or strut when you're not feeling your best. Make that a habit. So walk like a champion, even when you have doubts, or especially when you have doubts or fears.
Yeah. And there's an interesting sort of middle ground of we've had athletes where they're sort of performing well, but their body language is very neutral in a sense that even the coaches will comment on almost like your story previously about the soccer player of, how much do they want to be here? How much do they really want this? Are they really, it doesn't look like they're giving 100% even in practice. Whereas, we can tell even by the internal physiological metrics that they are. It's how do you give suggestions on how a coach might broach that subject? Because it's almost like for some of these players, they just need to show more better body language, let's say, because sometimes these are those players that are, not necessarily starters. They're on the bench or maybe potentially not on the team anymore. And there's a fine line. And it seems like this is actually playing a big role into terms of how their personality is impacting the team, or the perception from the staff of the personality impacting the rest of the players.
Yeah, that's definitely one area where there could definitely be miscommunication. I've had athletes that are more introverted. And so, coach or teammates might read into that like, oh, they don't care. They're not interested. They don't want to be here, when they do. It's just they're not as demonstrative in terms of their body language. I do think that you have to do business is being done. So, if you're part of a team, I think you have to challenge yourself to, even though it might not be your personality, to give the team what it needs. And that might be being a little bit more loud and proud in practice and in games. I like John Calipari at Kentucky basketball. He'll tell his guys like, hey, you don't have to talk outside of practice. If you're a quiet guy, be quiet outside of practice. But when you come into practice, you better be loud, you better be proud, you better be talkative, because we need that as a team. But I do think that for coaches or staff, when they see a player like that, assume that they're coming from a place of maybe they're a little shy or a little introverted, rather than, we tend to make these negative attributions, versus trying to understand them first. Like, hey, it seems like, you're a little bit more quiet with your body language. What's that all about? Are you tend to be more introverted or more shy? How can I help you to bring that out so that we show that great attitude that I know you have inside of you, versus, hey, shape up, kind of yelling at them, because then they feel shamed, embarrassed, and you're kind of coming from a negative that's not going to help them.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it reminds me of the idea of the player not giving it all in the training. I think it was Maurice Green quote around, on race day, on competition day, acting like you're the number one, you're the best. But when we're training, we've got to act like we're number two or number three. We've got to really be able to bring that. Can you talk about that shift in mindset of how the training mindset, which often, in nutrition, we talk about even training nutrition versus game day nutrition, and it's a similar theme in terms of mindset, no?
Yeah. I mean, practice is one of those things where, how do I get one day better today? And you need to find a way to do that. Again, some guys are a little more introverted. Some guys are a little more extroverted. So when I was with the San Francisco Giants, it was interesting. About half the team, the guys would kind of, like, let's say on the plane or the bus, they would kind of be just kind of in their own little world, just kind of real quiet, maybe on their phone or reading a book. And then the other half of the team would be playing cards and really loud and obnoxious and, and having fun and telling jokes and kind of ribbing each other. But, in terms of practice versus game day, ideally you want to practice the way you want to play and then play the way that you want to practice. I think the biggest mistake that the average athlete has is, practice doesn't really matter, which I would say, yeah, but it still counts. And
for sure.
But if you're waiting to turn it on during, flipping the switch on game day, lots of luck, because, you've kind of practiced not thinking like a champion or training like a champion. So to me, you really want to have the attitude that, practice is the big day. And then, if I practice like a champion, then it's easy to go out there and just play like a champion when it matters most.
Absolutely. And, in today's environment with, again, thinking sort of basketball, a lot of training load, and brings to mind the Allen Iverson quote about practice. And of course, agree 100% with all the greats like the Michael Jordans and the Tom Brady's, and the intensity they bring to practice to be able to be exact and to be able to be champions. Today we see obviously a lot of players doing that as well. We also see this sort of training load and guys maybe going through the paces a little bit in practice. That mindset of what you just described, how would we start to instill that? The idea that we do still need to bring it in practice, because on game day, this is, as you mentioned, you're not going to be able to just flip the switch.
Yeah, I love the quote from Kobe Bryant, the one where he said, it's not how many minutes you put into your practice, it's how many minutes your mind is into your practice.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And so, it's really about being where your feet are, as we say now. Mm-hmm. I like to say, be where your fangs are, because you want to be a predator. You want to be like, I love to hunt. I'm here to attack.
Yeah.
So it's really about presence, I would say. So measure your practices by the degree of presence. So what I would see is that, some players that were pretty good, you could tell that their mind is elsewhere, during different drills or different parts of practice, especially near the end of practice when we kind of just want to get to the finish line. Yeah. Whereas the better players that I'd be around, better athletes, they almost would, have the attitude, I'm going to run through the finish line at practice. So I almost want to be, like when practice ends, I'm going to be surprised because I'm so focused in terms of what I'm doing. So to me, it's about, high quality effort rather than just logging minutes, and kind of, you could say kind of like garbage time.
Yeah, and shifting gears here a little bit, Doc, I know you've got kids at home, and I've got 3 young girls, and this idea of young athletes and how we can support building a strong mindsets in kids, not just to make them great athletes, but also, life skills. And, you talk about the idea of commenting on, your child, your kid's attitude, their effort, but trying to avoid some of these sort of technical or tactical suggestions, which, being from Canada, ice hockey, this is a lot of hockey moms and dads giving suggestions out there. Why is that?
Well, I think it's important to, number one is realize how hard the game is. I was just out in Detroit working with Honey Baked Hockey Club. I think it's the biggest hockey club in the U.S. And so we did some parent workshops, and we're talking about before the game, not a lot of instruction, because if someone was telling me before I did something like, hey, remember this or remember that, I'm thinking, well, do they even trust me or believe in me? So that would kind of hurt my confidence, or just fill my mind up and I'd just be this kind of bloated bobblehead of information. So thumbs up, pat on the back, just a little bit of hey, go out there and do what you do, and I'm going to have fun watching it. During the game, compete against other parents to see who could have the most fun. Trust that your kid's going to be okay. And if there's a little bit of adversity, great. It's an opportunity for them to kind of develop some of that mental muscle. And then after the game, that car ride home is, that's where, hey, maybe we'll save the analysis till later and just, hey, I love watching you play. I'm so proud of you. What was, your favorite part of the game, that kind of stuff. But I do think that, one of the things I like to say is let the coaches be the coaches in terms of the instruction. And you're there for support and encouragement. But I do think that kids can pick up a lot from the mental game in terms of, the breathing, the body language, gratitude, what are you grateful for? What are you thankful for on your team? All these mental skills and strategies, goal setting, visualization, they could pick up these at a young age. And what's great, and I always love to hear this from student athletes, is, man, this really helps me in the classroom, or this really helps me at work. This helps me in other areas of my life. So I would say is, there's a little bit of a concern that, with parents or others that, you don't want to start kids too young with the mental game, whereas actually it probably should be the core of their game when they're young, because these truly are life skills. And it's not to make them more professional. It's to equip them with the know-how and the skills to really be resilient, mentally tough, and not only to play better, but to have more fun.
Yeah, that emotional resilience, the mental toughness. Where's a place to start really with kids? Would it be around the breathing or the gratitude as some simple ways to just begin that process?
Yeah, I have a great example from my own family. So I have a 10-year-old daughter, and when she was about 2, she was having a temper tantrum. And, I'm kind of looking at her while she's on the floor, arms flailing all over. And my wife, who's also a psychologist, but more of a research psychologist, she said, hey, why don't you teach her one of those breathing techniques that you teach your athletes? And I kind of slap myself on the forehead. I'm like, you knucklehead. I never even crossed my mind to do that. But so what I did is I laid down on the floor next to her, put my hand on my belly and kind of, breathed in and out. And my hand would go up and down. And she looked over at me and started doing the same thing. And then all of a sudden she started calming down and then started giggling. And so she learned breathing, kind of deep breathing, that relaxation response at such a young age. And then I would see her doing it on her own when things weren't going well for her with, in terms of what she wanted, or maybe she was tired. She would put her hand on her belly and let it go in and out. And so she was really learning how to calm herself. And composure is one of those key mental skills and characteristics of champions. And so I love the saying that cool heads win hot games.
Nice. Yeah, it is tremendous, isn't it? I mean, kids are like sponges and they really soak a lot of this stuff up. And it's amazing how just those little pieces, here and there can really start to build up in terms of their own practice. And like you say, it just dovetails into, school and the rest of their lives, right?
Yeah. And just even, in terms of just being more mindful in the moment, in terms of, when you're eating, taste your food. When you're drinking a sports drink or, cold, cup of water at practice, between sets or reps, really taste that water, and it's refreshing, it's energizing. So being more present, I think, is a big part of all this. I used to joke around, by asking the students when I worked at Arizona State University, what are you thinking about during practice? And they're, well, I'm thinking about homework. What do you think about doing while you're doing your homework? I'm thinking about something that happened earlier today. What are you thinking about when you're in class? I'm thinking about how sore I am. They were hardly ever in the moment. And so, just being more mindful, I think, is kind of at the center of the mental game. And then the confidence, concentration, composure, commitment, competitiveness, those other C words are really important.
Tremendous. And just to dovetail off that quickly, Doc, I mean, in today's environment of distractions, how do we, and not just for kids, obviously for parents and for all of us with the phones and everything else, how do we start to build some of those boundaries or layer in some of these techniques to actually, stay present, stay where our feet are?
Yeah, well, most of us, unfortunately, have the attention span of a goldfish, so not very long. And so I think one of the things is that our mind just naturally will drift. We'll tend to, whatever we're thinking about or doing in the moment, our mind will start to wander into the past or the future. So I think part of being good at focusing is being really good at refocusing. So noticing that when your mind goes somewhere, and it's usually a negative place. Oh, I can't believe I said that earlier today, or I can't believe, I'm already sore. Practice is going to really hurt later. Is just catching that and almost kind of like, just thinking of it as a parade that goes by or a leaf on a river that goes by. Just let it go. One of the things that was fun when I worked with the softball team and the baseball team at ASU, a lot of the athletes love the idea of F and F. And so if they started getting distracted or they made a mistake, they would write F and F on their glove or on their hat, and it stood for forget it and focus. And so, so we tend to, drift, but so that's where we catch ourselves and say, have a way to say, I'm back. Or I even like the idea, it's a great tool and a cheap one, is to put a rubber band around your wrist. And when you notice that you're really distracted thinking about other things outside of what you're doing in the moment, you snap the rubber band and then literally say to yourself, snap back. Yeah. And it's just, kind of be here now.
Tremendous. Well, listen, Doc, your work's been instrumental in my practice, and with Athletes at Canada Basketball and the new book, Leader's Mind, really, really tremendous. And so, where could people stay connected with you and keep up with all your tremendous work?
Well, thanks so much, Marc. I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm at Gold Medal Mind. My website is goldmedalmind.net. And then on Instagram, I'm newish to Instagram. It's Jim Afremow. Yeah, thanks for having me on today. The mental game to me is, I'm biased, but it's endlessly fascinating. And, I'm really excited about where the field is right now and where it's going to be in a few years from now. It just keeps getting better.
100%. Well, listen, I appreciate the time, and we'll definitely include all those links in the show notes. So thanks again, Doc.
Thanks, Marc. Appreciate it.